A Vietnam veteran. They are the grandfathers, fathers and mothers, aunts and uncles, and the sons and daughters who once fought to protect democracy. They made up 2.3 million that fought to protect this freedom, and as a result, it cost the lives of 58,220. Now fewer than 85,000 of these veterans remain, meaning only 1/3 of these men are alive. It's important we understand what these veterans endured before they can no longer tell their stories. What these veterans went through isn't just history. It is the now. And a veteran like Donald Sylvse is the living history of today. For Donald, the war may have ended and combat may be over, but battles continue in his life today as he deals with lasting effects from the war. Here's Donald's story.
Donald Sylvse. I'm a U.S. Army artillery officer. I served in Vietnam, one tour, 12 months. My total commitment was 7 years to the country.
Donald's military career began when he was drafted into the military. Graduation from Virginia Military Institute as a second lieutenant caused him to dedicate 7 years of service to the country. After being stationed at Fort Hill and then to Fort Hood, his unit was sent to Vietnam. There he served a 12-month tour as a U.S. Army artillery officer. He recounts his experiences.
I guess the thing that stands out most, we went by troop ship, which was 19 days in the sea, landed in Da Nang, got off the LST, and I said, we're in one of the largest rice-producing countries in the world, and there laid hundreds of bags of rice from Texas. And I thought, what's wrong with this picture? Not only was it a combat zone, but it also, the temperatures and the humidity were unreal. What people don't understand is you were in temperatures of 100 degrees, humidity of 100%. During the monsoon season, which was 6 months, it rained continuously. So you were, even if you weren't in the rice paddies, you were soaking wet, whether it was from perspiration or whether it was from the rain. And the living conditions were hell, I'm sorry. And of course, just arriving in country, you're scared to death of what's going to happen and where you're going and what job you're going to be assigned.
He further explains combat and its long-lasting effects.
I think combat affects everybody. I was an executive officer for a 105 howitzer battery, and that's why I'm deaf today. But we supported an infantry unit, and starting in January of '68, we moved 9 times in 3.5 months in support of those operations. And being under fire, not every day, but many days, it has an effect on you, and it's a lasting effect. Many of us still can remember.
Many soldiers were put into combat at 18 to 19 years old. Yet, these kids were still placed in high-stress combat situations. Sylvse explains how he felt age had a dramatic effect on defeating these kids' morale.
Well, I tell people we were a bunch of kids doing what we were told to do. And most of the men in my unit were 18, 19. Some of them were there because the judge told them you either sign up or you're going to the slammer. And so, but they were all fine soldiers, and they did their job. But yes, it became frustrating at many times. You'd be on a mission, and all of a sudden, they'd stop the mission, short of accomplishing the task. And so you say, we lost men, we had men wounded, and we didn't accomplish what we should have. And I think that has a lasting effect on everybody. I'm sorry, but it does.
In 1967, America was only halfway through the Vietnam War. Yet a study from Cornell University found that in October of 1967, only 44% of the American people felt the country should still be in the war. Anti-war protesters numbering 100,000 flooded the Capitol that October, and demonstrations would begin flooding college campuses around the country. Many of these demonstrations stem from the lack of understanding of the My Lai massacre on March 16, 1968. A company of soldiers would murder 500 unarmed civilians of My Lai, including women, children, infants, and old men. In November 1969, journalist Seymour Hersh would publish a story about the My Lai massacre, portraying the events on the battlefield. This ultimately divided the country even more and led to a negative perception of Vietnam veterans.
At that point in time, in 1968 era, there was a large group of people that called us baby killers and everything else. And I think it's because they didn't know. They just wanted to protest, so to speak. It was a sad thing to come home. But when we arrived at Fort Lewis, Washington to get out and come home, we were instructed that if we were going through major airports, we would take our uniforms off. And that really got to a lot of the veterans. We'd spent 12 months in hell and come home and say, take your uniform off so you don't get harassed. One of my brothers that's from Bedford County tells a story about coming home on the bus from Pittsburgh, and the lady in the bus terminal said, you don't go out to the bus till we tell you can. And he said, why? He said, because we want you to be alive when you get home. So it was a very trying time for those of us that came home to those conditions. The thing is, many of us came home and we didn't tell anybody we were Vietnam vets for many years, only because we didn't know how they'd react.
Vietnam veterans would receive little to no support from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs to deal with their mental health arriving home. There was limited treatment for post-traumatic stress and other injuries, and few programs to help veterans find employment. Over 100,000 committed suicide, and thousands more ended up in jail or on the street. One of the biggest issues Sylvester holds against the country was the lack of assistance from the VA. Sylvester expresses,
I think that was the biggest issue that I hold against our country and our politicians and the VA. There was no help when we came home. I suffer from PTSD. I go to the VA regularly for treatment and plus medication. Some days are better than others, but that's life and it goes on. But they waited 50 years to do anything for us. It's been here for a long time. Second World War, they called it shell shock. It just became PTSD recently. It's all the same.
PTSD was not officially recognized as a mental health condition until 5 years following the Vietnam War in 1980. With lack of public awareness of what a soldier went through, the public was not equipped to give Vietnam veterans the support they needed when returning home. Sylvester explains how a public unequipped to deal with PTSD led him to push his problems away.
I think if we'd have been treated when we came home or evaluated to determine whether we had a problem, and it didn't have to be the day we arrived back home, but I came home in August of '68, and it was August of 2013 before I realized that I had an issue. And it only happened because one of my brothers took his own life after 43 years. And I told my wife, I said, I think I gotta go be evaluated before I do something that will impact my family. And so I did. And as my therapist said, you came home, you put everything in a closet, and you slammed the door shut. And she said when John was took his life, he said, the door came open and you can't put the stuff back in the closet.
There was an average of 17 United States war veterans who committed suicide every day in 2017. For this reason, Sylvester feels it is essential for veterans battling with PTSD to get help.
Get help. I'll take you. I'll talk to you. And I think vets are becoming more apt to get help. The suicide rate against vets is horrendous. It's 20 a day. And did they get help? Probably not. And I think family has to have help also to understand how they can be of assistance to a veteran, be they a Vietnam veteran or more recently Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever.
Although he is receiving help, he reiterates the struggles he still is facing.
Fortunately enough, I came home. Still have issues today with that time spent in country, but I thank God I came home, as I say, almost whole. I think every veteran has a lasting effect. Some are more prominent than others. I think those who lost a brother while they were next to them, that's a very difficult thing to overcome. When you're in an area of combat, everybody gets close because you're doing your very best to take care of your brother who's alongside of you. And I think the longer you're in a combat situation, that brotherhood becomes much closer, so those kind of things become more, I don't want to say tragic, they become more lasting.
Almost whole is a feeling we can hope to eradicate in our servicemen and women. But we must acknowledge the guilt many veterans face returning home from war. He explains.
You come back with that, why wasn't it me? And I think a lot of vets came home with, who lost brothers in combat, come home and say, why did I make it? Why wasn't it me?
This "why wasn't it me" would spark motivation for the rest of Sylvester's life. He elaborates.
I think my service and has affected my life in the fact that I made an agreement on that troop ship with the man upstairs that if I was fortunate enough to come home, I would dedicate the rest of my life to service of the country. And I've tried to do that in service to this community and to the county and outside the county.
Part of his service includes educating students about the Vietnam War to create a society that is informed of what a veteran endures.
I think it's critically important for students to learn about the conflict as much as they can, only because we have a generation of soldiers who served there, the same as we have some World War II vets, but it had an impact on those people that served. It also had an impact on our country.
Sylvester explains how, as a public, it is our duty to help our veterans.
I just think the public needs to be a part. They need to take the time not to come up and shake my hand and say thank you for your service. We appreciate that. But take 5 minutes and talk to that veteran, wherever he served, and get a better understanding, not of what he went through during conflict, but what that veteran is going through now. Just be his friend. Listen. You don't have to comment. You don't have to do anything. But I think it's important that our country realizes what a veteran goes through whenever, not just a Vietnam vet. And I think they need to understand that we did that because we believed in our country, we believed in our flag.
President Lincoln's promise to care for him who shall have been born the battle is something we must continue to do by serving and honoring the men and women who are America's veterans. It is essential we do our due diligence as citizens to honor all veterans who believed in our flag and have sacrificed everything for us. To Donald Sylvse and the millions of others who fought and are fighting for our country, almost whole is something we hope a veteran never has to feel with the support from an educated society.